Adayotaedi, sisters and brothers and sisters, welcome this morning as we look at our worshiping this morning. We're going to continue on with another reading here from the Hebrew Bible. So if you have your Hebrew Bibles available, you want to turn to Ruth chapter 3, and we're going to read from verses 1 through 5. And then also 4, 13 through 17. We're going to kind of bring them together. It's a long story that the text actually shortens up so that we can have a better opportunity to get right at the text here. So let's have a reading here. Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, I need to seek some security for you so that it may be well with you. Now here's our kinsman Boaz, with whose young women you have been working. See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Now wash and anoint yourself, and put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." She said to her, "All that you tell me, I will do." So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When they came together, the Lord made her conceive, and she bore a son. When the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without next of kin, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne you." Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom, and she became his nurse. The women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse, the father of David. All right, before we get too far into this, first of all, let me let you know that today, or this month, in November, is Native American Awareness Month. So on the bulletin, you'll see a little bit of Cherokee on here, and our sermon is entitled Adayotaedi, and that is Cherokee for sharing. And so this morning, we want to look a little bit into sharing. And let me ask you, have you ever had to deal with sibling rivalry? Now, I know I grew up with several brothers and sisters, and I'm sure all of you have brothers and sisters, or at least some of you do, most of you do anyway. And those of you who had children of your own probably have more than one child and have challenges that way with separating the kids from time to time. Because if there's one thing that kids are really good at not doing, it is sharing with each other. There's always ongoing challenges and conflict in that direction. And in that sense, it's like they're learning from the start, early on, how important it is to look out for themselves. Survival. It's all about being focused on the me. But as you get older, in theory, we're supposed to become more aware of God's presence in our world, in our lives, and to think about how important it is to look out for each other, basically to share. And our reading today shows in the book of Ruth how incredible it was that Naomi was willing to look out for her daughter-in-law, who was a foreigner, an outsider, to make sure that she was okay. Now, if y'all know the backstory on Ruth, you'll know that Naomi and her husband and 2 sons went from Judah during a famine over to a foreign land, and at that point, Naomi's husband died, and she had married her children off to the locals in the foreign land, and then things got better in that land and in Judah, but then both her sons died, and according to the text, there doesn't seem to have been any children to that point. And so Naomi had decided to go back to Judah, where there was now, the famine was over, and her family was there, and she could try to get some help. Her daughter-in-laws wanted to go with her because they loved her and cared for her, and maybe there was some problems with them marrying a foreign husband. Don't know, but anyway, they wanted to go with Naomi back to Judah, and in fact, Naomi had tried to get them to stay behind, to be with their mothers, stay with their hometown, and there they'd be looked after. And one of the daughters, one of the sister-in-laws there, she stayed back. But Ruth said, no, I'm going to be with you. I'm going to stick with you. I'm going to watch out for you. I'm going to take care of you. Whatever happens to you, that happens to me. So now the clock has moved forward. We're back in Judah, and Ruth is totally devoted to her daughter-in-law, so much so that she is willing to share her family and the resources of the community to take care of Ruth. And that's pretty awesome. That really is. Because I remember when I was younger, back in the day, that soap operas were a big thing. Soap operas were a big hit. And I understand that they're still going. And I got to tell you, the one that stood out the most popular one that I remember when I was in junior high school down in Altus, Oklahoma, was Young and the Restless. That was the soap opera on track back then. And those characters and everybody within them, I can tell you flat out that sharing was not something that they were interested in doing. In fact, it was the complete opposite. They were fighting and backstabbing. I mean, one of the older main characters in that soap opera had even kidnapped someone and imprisoned them in the basement of his house, and had kept this woman down there in this basement in a cage for a long time. I lost interest in it. I can't remember how long she was down there. But lo and behold, here we are some decades later, and I'm not going to tell you how many, but decades later, today that show is still going. They're still doing the same thing, and yet they still have some of those same characters. In fact, that lead character, I know he's still on there. I'm like, how in the world do they get away with this stuff? In real life, that wouldn't have happened. But the fact is, these soap operas create a culture. They project a culture that doesn't involve sharing. It's not a priority in their lives. In fact, what is a priority in their lives is keeping up with the Jones, getting that money, getting those resources for themselves and not for other people. But looking out for their own selves, not even for their families. They're just looking out for themselves. And, it makes you wonder how many of them are really concerned about being healthy, heart conscious, versus financially wealthy. What are their priorities? So in Ruth, we can see here, and we can find right in here, in fact, this story, this book, the teachings in it are so valued that even in a long time ago, a patriarchal society, that the Judaic people valued it so much that they put it among their sacred texts. The story written by a foreigner was so important to them that they put it in their sacred text. That shows how much they value the teachings that are shared by Ruth. The life experience of Ruth in sharing, in community, in redemption, all these things are God's values. All these things are God's priorities. And we have to look at today, what are our priorities? What are our values in our lives? And when we think about the culture here in North America and how today there's such a strong movement of individualism, personal wealth, and ambition versus sharing your resources, not only financially, but also emotionally, spiritually, and physically. I haven't even got started on that yet. So let me tell you a story here. I'm going to share you a little story here, so I find it amongst my stack of papers here. I actually printed out the text for today a little bit bigger letters to make it easier for me to read, and I forgot to pull it up, so kind of slowed up my reading a little bit. Joys of getting older, huh? Let me share you a story here. It's called Heaven and Hell. A man spoke with the Lord about heaven and hell. I will show you, said the Lord. And they went into a room which had a large pot of stew in the middle. The smell was delicious. And around the pot sat people who were famished and desperate. All were holding spoons with very long handles which reached to the pot. But because the handles of the spoons were longer than their arms, it was impossible to get the stew into their mouths. Their suffering was terrible. Now I will show you heaven, said the Lord. And they went into an identical room. There was a similar pot of stew, and the people had the same identical spoons, but they were all well nourished, talking and happy. At first, the man did not understand. It is simple, said the Lord. You see, they have learned to feed each other. When we look at the text of Ruth and we look at the text in our New Testament reading from Mark, where the story of the widow's mite is in there, we see a similar concept, a similar value that involves sharing. Now, in this sense, what was valued most back in those days was survival. And survival meant having sons, which is really why the text in Ruth points that out. It guaranteed that the property lineage would remain within the family, so the family would be able to survive for an extended generation time frame. And in the New Testament reading, we see that in the temple, making their tithes, making their offering, is an important part of the reality of the religious teachings of that time. But what is at the core of it? What we see in Ruth here and what we see in Jesus' teaching is not so much the amount that you give, but the motive that is behind it. Why are you giving? What's your motive? What's your priority in your life? And what we see here in Naomi, her priority was not herself. Her priority was for the safety and the security of others. Her daughter-in-law, who, isn't really still in that role because her daughter-in-law's husband's dead, but she's still family to Naomi. Even though she's a foreigner, an outsider, brought her in, and she made sure that she would have the knowledge and expertise that she needed to get the attention of Boaz and to show Boaz how important it is for him to have Ruth in his life, and he got the message. They all valued each other. They all learned to feed each other, to support one another for the benefit of everyone involved and not just themselves. And that's what we see in Jesus' teaching as well. We see Jesus prioritizing sharing, coming from a place of love and concern for the welfare and the well-being of others and not just ourselves. And I know that when you're hurting, when you're struggling in your own life, it's really difficult to think about how God is blessing you. When you're dealing with serious health issues, problems in your work environment, other challenges going on in the world today, it's really tough to think about having a loving and sharing heart. And that's why relying upon God is so much more important than relying on ourselves. On our own, we can't do this. But with God's help, through God's grace and presence in our lives, we can be strong and have a sharing heart, a sharing spirit, one that is supportive of others, regardless of who they are, what their background is, where they come from, or who they belong to. Just as we see in our reading from Ruth today and in our reading from the Gospel of Mark, where in the temple, the widow came and gave everything she had out of her poverty to God in gratitude for God's blessing and support, while others who had far greater abundance gave just enough to get by, to put on a good show, but not really sharing from the heart what they could have shared. So I challenge you right now, how much is enough? How much of God's blessing do you have to have in your life before you are willing to surrender that need to have everything? That need to look out for yourself instead of looking out for others. Think about that in yourself. Who do you more relate to? Do you relate to the Naomi, our hero in the book of Ruth right now? Do you relate to the widow in the story from Mark? Or do you relate more to those who just give enough to get by, to make a good appearance? You think about that. Because God would rather that we be remembered for how we shared and not for what we squandered, how wealthy we became. Something for you to consider this week. Walk in peace.